So thank you all, everyone, for joining the third Pour More conversation as we take advantage of this downtime to travel to other countries from our living rooms, since we still can't safely visit those places for a while. We are so excited to resume international travel in 2021, but today we have a special opportunity to speak directly with two important luminaries in the field of Cuban and American music. Cuba and the US have always had a tumultuous relationship, but our musicians have been the most successful sector of society to consistently thrive at communicating, honoring, and inspiring one another across our borders from the very beginning until now. So we hope that other sectors of society will soon learn from our musicians and follow in their footsteps. As Preservation Hall Jazz Band's Charlie Gabriel says, music conversation cancels out complication. And so today we will go deep into better understanding the great relationship between our music. Ben Jaffe and Preservation Hall Jazz Band are close friends of ours from our work. We are producing a number of concert tours to Cuba for the band over the past 5 years. This includes their first tour that inspired their album, So It Is, and turned into the hit film, Tuba de Cuba, that we encourage you all to see if you haven't already. We'll be watching the trailer and talking about it later in this conversation. Preservation Hall Jazz Band and Foundation have been committed to reigniting important historical links between the music of New Orleans and the Caribbean. The bridges they've been creating to Cuba are very important, and I'm excited to discuss them more in this conversation. We're also honored to have musicologist, historian, and producer Ned Sublette with us today. Ned Sublette is the author of 4 best-selling books, Cuba and Its Music, From the First Drums to the Mambo, The World That Made New Orleans, From Spanish Silver to Congo Square, The Year Before the Flood, A Story of New Orleans, and with Constance Sublette, The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry. Personally, as both a composer and a producer in Cuba for the past 20 years, I have to say that Cuba and Its Music was the most exhilarating, fascinating, and informative book on Cuba that I've ever read. This is it right here. It masterfully tells the larger story of Cuba using music as a vehicle to understand a much larger story about culture, migration, politics, spirituality, global affairs, economics, and everything in between, going back to the Phoenicians in 760 BC and ending with the Cuban Revolution. It's a history book that reads like a fast-page turning love novel. Project Pour More highly recommends it to our travelers to read before going on our trips. And I know many of you have also read it and have told me how much you enjoyed it. Ned is also the founder of Post Mambo Studies Incorporated, which between 2016 and the onset of the pandemic specialized in taking travelers on musically immersive seminars in Cuba. Travelers on Post Mambo's January 2020 trip, Tierra Sagrada, experienced 14 bembes, sacred parties for the gods, and 8 days in Western Cuba. Together with Cuban musicologist Carrie Diaz, he founded and produced El Rumbazo, an annual festival of rumba in Cuba, presented in 2017 and 2018. El Rumbazo was put on pause by new sanctions against Cuba announced by John Bolton in 2019, but will return when such things are possible again and when travel is safe. He is currently editing 2 movies shot in Cuba on post-Mambo trips. Finally, before we move on, I'd like to announce that our next speaker will be the Cuban-American scholar Ruth Bahar on Thursday, July 30th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. Ruth is a MacArthur Award-winning writer, cultural anthropologist, professor at the University of Michigan, and modern nomad who will be leading our next conversation entitled Literary and Jewish Journeys to Cuba. Now we'll turn it over to Alyssa, who will discuss Zoom conference technicalities and overview.
All right, hi everyone, thanks for joining. Today's event will go for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Ned Sublette and Ben Jaffe will discuss Cuban and American music for about an hour for about 40 minutes, and then they will share a few short video clips. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the event. If you have a question or comment during the discussion, you may ask it at any time by typing in the question and answer window at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will get to as many questions as we can, but because of the large number of attendees, we probably won't be able to answer everyone's question. We will be sharing links that relate to the talk throughout the event in the chat panel. So if you have a question, please write it in the Q&A box so it doesn't get mixed up with the links we will be sharing. If there is a question asked that seems to be popular, you can go ahead and upvote it by liking the question. So that way it'll head to the top of our panel. And then finally, please note that this conversation is being recorded. So if you have to leave the forum for any reason before it ends, we will be posting it on our Facebook page. And if you like it, please share it with your friends. Now I'm gonna turn it over to Ned Sublette. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And hello, everybody. See a lot of familiar names showing up. Where to begin? First, I wanted to say that Cuba, I assume everybody's been following what's been happening with coronavirus in Cuba, but maybe not. It's too early for anybody to take a victory lap, but it sure looks like they've crushed it. It's looking pretty good right now. As you may know, Florida had over 10,000 cases in a single day. Cuba hasn't cumulatively had 3,000 confirmed cases yet. They have fewer than 100 active cases right now. They've had fewer than 100 deaths. Bars and restaurants have reopened in Havana, and they've established a new form of tourism, of safe tourism, which just went into effect. And we'll see how it works, but the idea is they're going to be taking people directly from the airport with medical teams in attendance to one of the keys off the north coast of the island where they have their major tourist installations. And maybe that's not really what we do with Post Mambo. We go all over the country. And in this first phase, tourists aren't going, I don't even like the word tourists, but that's what this will be. Tourists won't be allowed to, even on the mainland at first. But, if it's cold and you're in Canada, you might want a safe place to go medically that is also warm. So this might actually work really well. I'm really curious to see how this is going to work out, but I'm really heartened by what Cuba has achieved in combating the virus. And I hope they can keep it going. I was talking to a colleague in Sagua La Grande where we've done a lot of work, and they haven't had a single confirmed case there, apparently. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about the future once we get through whatever it is we've got to get through first. The work that I've been doing for the last 5 years with post-Mambo studies, it started with the surprise opening by President Obama. And very quickly, I had led tours to Cuba before, but I had stopped after the harassment of the George W. Bush years. And I had people come up to me and say, hey, let's go to Cuba. Let's get a group together. I want to go with you. And I very quickly realized that this was something that I had to do. And it turned into a real thing. We had, I think, how many did we have? 12 seminars over the 5 years. And we were planning a denser schedule of them. We've been all over the island in granular detail, going to the places that I'd always wanted to go to, visiting both practitioners of traditional music and especially Afro-Cuban religious music, and also pretty much all the major pop artists at one time or another performed for us. I figure between the trips, Cari Diaz and I have produced about 200 plus live events in Cuba in the last 5 years. And it was really something that was going somewhere, and I hope we can get back to it soon. And I hope when we do that y'all will come with us. In January, John Bolton, as I previously mentioned, had announced these measures that took several of our trips out. We had planned a festival of Cuban women's music, and we had planned El Rumbazo #3, a mega rumba throwdown. with groups from all over the country. But those were looking dicey according to the rule changes, but there's one rule that they had never changed and won't, which is religious travel. Religious travel will always be acceptable to the US government. And in fact, we had one planned, Tierra Sagrada. We went, as our introduction said, we went to 14 Bembes in 8 days all over Western Cuba. And it was, I've had, with all these trips, I've had people say that these were life-transforming experiences, and never more so than January. I'm so happy that in January we managed to pull this off and go visit, go to tambores for the orishas and Congo ceremonies and other stuff as well in Havana, Matanzas, Sawa, and smaller towns. So now let's zoom out back into history, which is what I do, and talk about, since we have Ben Jaffe here with us. Hi, Ben. How you doing? He's muted. We're gonna get into some conversation later. About the same time I got started with Post Mambo, Ben Jaffe and Craig Lucas and the Pres Hall people reached out to me, and they were doing a mighty project, which turned out to be a really great thing. It's been so exciting to see what's been happening, and in particular to see New Orleans emerge through the work of a number of entities working in parallel. Pres Hall, also Cubanola Collective with Ariana Hall, who I was planning to do a post-Mambo visit to New Orleans with, just with Pres Hall, just as COVID came crushing down. We started we started talking about Cuban music versus New Orleans music versus American music. And this is actually one of the main themes of my book, Cuban, It's Music. What is the difference? Why and how are North American and Cuban music so different? And there are all kinds of historical reasons. If you've read the book, you more or less know what I have to say. But just real quickly, I want to share a map with you. I love this map. I always try to work it in. Let's see, here it is. Can you share? Can you see this map, everybody? Please nod your head if you can see the map. Yes, thank you. This is a map from 1727. As you can see, it's English. It's a map of the West Indies, but look what it is. It's a map of what basically was the New World in 1727 in many ways. And look what's at the center of it. Havana, right? And look what's not on this map. New Orleans. New Orleans had been founded 9 years previously. Natchitoches, where I lived till I was 9 in the 1950s, founded in 1714, 4 years before, is on this map. New Orleans isn't here. New Orleans wasn't nothing yet, wasn't important yet. And it was a French territory at the time. But look also at these dotted lines. These dotted lines are everything. These dotted lines show you what Cuba was all about in its formative centuries, which is to say it was the truck stop at the end of the world. It was the place where the silver and the gold that was ripped out of the bowels of Mexico and Peru came back, were stored in the Castillo de Real Fuerza, in the oldest castle in Havana, still one of my favorite places to visit there. They came from Peru, up across Panama by portage to Cartagena, and up here to Havana, and they came from Mexico, across here, from Veracruz to Havana. They all met up and went back to Europe, specifically to Spain, where they were bringing Europe's money supply on in what was called the fleet, the flota. Every year the flota sailed. It hung out for weeks and months sometimes in Havana, Alejandro de la Fuente's book about Cuba in Havana in the 16th century has some fascinating detail about this whole process. And they took, you know, while they were waiting to ship out, which could be weeks or months, they did what sailors do when they're hanging out. They, you know, drink, dance, gamble, screw. Music was going on in Havana. Havana was a service economy. It had more, when the fleet was in season, sometimes triple the regular population of Havana was in town. And often in between fleets, the people of Havana would go out to the countryside to raise food to sell to the sailors when they came back next year. So Havana wasn't even really a city in some formal ways, but it was the center where all the music and dance that was creolizing in all these, all over the Afro-Latin world came together and got danced together in the same low-life taverns on the same docks and then shipped back to Spain. I want to show you one other, let me just actually zoom in on this a little. If I can, oh, it's not letting me zoom. Okay, I want to show you one other graphic that I really like. I have to, pardon me, I have to stop sharing and reshare to do this. Zoom. Thank you. Sorry. Pardon. There we go. This is worth it, I promise. There's a site, a weather site called windy.com, which has a tab for currents where you can actually see the Gulf Stream visualized. Can you see this? I love this map. And this is in real time. This is right now. There's some kind of real serious loop current going on right now here in the Gulf, you can see. But this current has determined so much about American history. When this was the express lane in the sea back to Europe. This was, you know, you couldn't go against this current very easily. And when you, as people know who know me, one of my pet peeves is when they call New Orleans the northernmost town of the Caribbean. It's not. It's on the Gulf of Mexico. This is the Gulf of Mexico. And as you'll see, there's quite a barrier actually between New Orleans and the Caribbean. It wasn't that easy in the early days. New Orleans was really isolated at first. And this hives off from the coast right around Cape Fear, North Carolina. Cape Fear, one of the oldest place names in North America, named for obvious reasons, because this was a fearful place to navigate. Virginia, the first North American colony, is located up here out of reach of the Spanish, because the history of what becomes the United States begins here in northern Florida. Okay, and so here are the Spanish Catholics, here are the Anglo-American Protestants. And here's the Gulf Stream. This is the grid against which all this happens. Now there's another grid we got to superimpose on this, which is Catholicism versus Protestantism. New Orleans isn't the northernmost town of the Caribbean, right? But New Orleans is the northernmost town of something. We're clear on that. It's the northernmost town that shuts down for carnival, right? It's the northernmost town where the whole street turns out to celebrate this very Catholic festival that in classic New Orleans fashions, the Protestants took over. And when New Orleans was annexed by Thomas Jefferson's men, there was not a Protestant church in New Orleans and there was not a Catholic church in Boston. New Orleans is the northernmost part of the Catholic world in the hemisphere, as was Florida in the Spanish days, right? And this was like, think of the greatest antagonisms today in between two war religions, and you'll be about right for the level of hatred and distrust between Catholics and Protestants. The Catholics had a very different way of relating to the African religions. And a different and Spanish-derived slave system had a very different way of treating the enslaved than the Anglo-American system. Much larger than we can talk about tonight, but all of which is to say that these two musical systems are very, very different. One of the key differences, I think, is that Senegal, the presence or absence of the Senegambians. Senegal, as you may know, is in the northernmost part of the area that was slaved in Africa. Let's see if we can scoot over here. Over here, this was the easiest part to get to North America from, because Africa is humongous, and look what they had to go to come from Congo all the way up and over. So the foundational cultures, Black cultures of the three great fountainheads of African American culture were Senegambian in origin. There were Senegambians in the early days of Chesapeake, Senegambians in the early days of Carolina, and Senegambians in the early days of the Gulf Coast. And they have a very different music than farther down in Africa. And there are all kinds of key things we can point to. I mean, most obviously, swing, that feeling. If you listen to Senegalese choral music, that feeling does not really exist in Congo, does not exist in Cuba. And Cuban music doesn't swing. Cuban music is straight eighth notes, polyrhythms stacked together by means of a rhythmic key called clave. This is a very, very different rhythmic system than the one built on swing time, bent notes, blue notes, a simpler kind of texture, a very different way of making words fit to music, and different instrumentation. Of course, obviously the banjo, Senegambian derived, which we see in Virginia, which we see in Jamaica, does not turn up in Cuba. So these are two very different musical cultures from the get-go. Now, New Orleans was in a lot of contact with Havana once the Spanish took it over in the 1760s. And for 200 years or so, New Orleans's most important trading partner was always Havana. The embargo of Havana was an embargo of New Orleans. The significant thing for me, I mean, the thing that kind of blows my mind about Pres Hall going back to Havana is that Pres Hall was founded in what year, Ben?
Well, they had music that was starting in the 50s, and then it was established as Preservation Hall in 61.
And 61 is, of course, the year of the Bay of Pigs, the end of relationships between the U.S. and Cuba, and the beginning of the embargo. It was the beginning of the cutoff of Cuban music, which had always been coming into New Orleans, and always been renovating music in New Orleans. That stopped in 1961. And so for Pres Hall to come back to Havana under the conditions made possible by President Obama and his team was a really, really important restoration of a historical link. I think that's my first phrase for right now. Let me see. What do you think, Ben? I mean, when you went to Cuba, what were you thinking in these terms? Were you thinking in terms of like, what were you thinking? What did you think you would find?
Oh,
I had no idea. When I first went to Cuba, I thought I had some idea because I was a salsa head in New York. I had no idea.
right. You know, my whole idea of Cuba was really informed by the music of Jelly Roll Morton, and this phrase that he was credited with, saying that one of the elements of New Orleans music is the Spanish tinge. in New Orleans music. And that was something that always stuck in my mind, and researching and just people talking to me about the origins of New Orleans music, and beginning to understand the history of New Orleans music and Godshock and the relationship of New Orleans and Cuba, and the Creole music of New Orleans. It was all very confusing to me, because I heard, I grew up with musicians who played with my father who spoke Creole, but also were playing, El Manicero, the peanut vendor, but would be speaking kind of patois, almost like a French accent. So it was all very confusing to me. And of course, I had, I had friends that had made their way to Cuba, and like yourself, when I was in college, was really the first time that I began to hear salsa music, and that just began opening up all of these doors and ideas. I just couldn't wait to get there. What was really important to me, though, was the members of our band, the members of the collective, having an opportunity to learn something significant about themselves and about New Orleans music that is very different from New Orleans music, but New Orleans music wouldn't really exist without it. And I think you said it perfectly about the beat, the swing of the New Orleans beat, the kind of reverse emphasis of the beat in New Orleans, the syncopated rhythm here, and the very metronomic eighth note, very exact eighth note beat of Cuban music. But yet Cuba has informed so much of New Orleans music, and I wanted to know whether or not New Orleans music had informed Cuba, if it was a two-way street. So it was really just, an experiment for me. And it was life-changing,
I interviewed Chucho Valdez. The first time I interviewed Chucho Valdez was in early February 1990, my first trip to Cuba. My first week there, I was making a documentary for Afropop Worldwide. And it was the first time I'd interviewed anybody. This wasn't what I had been doing. And I asked him like the dumbest possible question, but it actually was a real question I had. I said, what's the difference between Latin jazz and jazz? And he looked at me and he said, diferencia está en el ritmo. Differences in the rhythm.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, unbidden, he reminded me that there was a maritime link between New Orleans and Havana throughout the 19th century.
Right.
Then this took no more than 5 minutes for this entire interview, and then he went off to play baseball with, they were on a break during an Erekeri rehearsal. And I spent the next 15 years researching, and it turns out Chucho was right.
Yes, and I do have to say that your book was enormously important in informing our understanding of what we were walking into. One of the conversations we had as a band going to Cuba was we were a little scared about the musicians we were going to encounter.
For good reason.
For good reason. We had met enough Cuban musicians over our lifetime. We were really scared. And we talked about it. We talked about musicians that come to New Orleans, and the difference when you meet musicians who come to New Orleans in prayer position, on a pilgrimage, instead of with their hands open, what can you give me, but in what can I give you, what can I offer? And that's how we wanted to go to Cuba. We understood that. We really spent the year leading up to that trip, or at least the last 6 months leading up to the trip, sitting in a circle, playing rhythms, just playing rhythmic instruments, for about 4 or 5 hours a week. We would get together and just make a percussion circle, and it really made a difference when we went to Cuba. I found that our entry into Cuba was greeted with more open arms, because we had really submitted ourselves to this process of educating ourselves and approaching it the way we appreciate it when people come to New Orleans, knowing we don't want them to be experts on New Orleans music. We just want them to be curious,
done their homework, right?
And done some homework, and know who the important people are, and that really did make a difference. And your book absolutely made a huge difference for all of us, because a lot of the history is not taught in school. My parents arrived in New Orleans in '61, so they were arriving as the city was going through the civil rights movement, and Cuba was shutting down. So a lot of their friends that they had in the French Quarter, a lot of the sort of inside outsider scene that was happening in the French Quarter, were Cuban families that had been shut off from their families, and their businesses had gone from very, very lucrative shipping companies to all of a sudden not having anything.
Yeah, and Cuban music had been a part and parcel of United States music up until this break in relations. I always make the point that Cuban music was in 1960, when Fidel rolled into Havana in January 1959, there were, I forget how many records on the Billboard charts with cha-cha in the title. It was the cha-cha-cha boom had been going for 7 years and was still underway already. 6 years. And 50 million people heard Marco Risso's I Love Lucy theme every week on TV. The idea of a nightclub, all the way back, the 20th century, the 19th century, you find the immense influence of Cuba in the music of the United States in all kind of ways that we don't really think about, and it happened in waves over and over again. In my book, I talk about a couple of the key moments. Not one of them was 1931 and the worldwide hit of The Peanut Vendor, El Manicero, which we're going to talk more about before we're done. And the other real key moment, well, there had been key moments in the 19th century, but we're talking about post-recording. The Manteca, Dizzy Gillespie Chano Pozo collaboration of 1948 transformed jazz, transformed the idea of songwriting, I would go so far as to argue, transformed the idea of what a bass line could be, and transformed also the notion of what Cuba was. It was clear now that Cuba was black in a way that perhaps had been avoidable to understand before in the United States. I talked to an old jazz musician in Harlem who told me that, who remembered the days when Dizzy and Chano were playing. He said, for us, the revelation was to think that Cubans could be black. We didn't know that, right? And of course, what Chano was drawing on is something that doesn't exist here. Because Chano, grew up in a barrio where the elders were born in Africa. Africans were brought to Cuba until the 1860s. Africans, when I talk to classes, I always ask them if anyone knows when the importation of kidnapped Africans was prohibited by federal law. Almost nobody does. I think as important a date as 1619 in many ways, January 1st, 1808. That was the end of the African slave trade to the U.S. So by 1860, and very few Africans were brought to the United States comparatively. 389,000, I think. I could, if I was to share my screen again and show you Barbados, how tiny it is, right? Barbados is about the size of Queens. Barbados took more Africans than the entire North American continent, right?
Mm.
Well, excluding Mexico in the 16th century. Barbados, the first big sugar island, took maybe 500,000 kidnapped Africans, only 389,000 to the entire United States, right? And I mean, in the colonial years, by 1860, there are 4 million kidnapped there are 4 million enslaved African Americans. How did 389,000 become 4 million? They were born here. That's not what happened in Cuba. In Cuba, Africans were worked to death in the sugar mills and often died within 8 to 10 years of being forced to work 20 hours a day of hard, dangerous labor in peak season, and were replaced with fresh arrivals from the slave trade. This lasted for quite some decades in the 19th century. And so in the 1860s, there were still Africans being brought to Cuba, right? Almost 55 years after it had stopped, after Africans had stopped coming to the United States. So this had enormous impacts on how Cuban culture developed, also the sheer number. We don't really know how many Africans were brought to Cuba, but at least double as many as were brought to the United States, and from different parts of Africa. The Yoruba in Cuba, who have a strong sense of clave in their music, almost no Yoruba were brought to North America. So we're looking at this very, very different Black world that occasionally flashes into the consciousness in North America and changes the music over and over again, and changed the music in Africa, I might add. Something that I really should have put in Cuban music, but it was long enough. Starting during the Depression, when the Victor and gramophone companies reissued what they call the GV series in Africa, they released all of these Cuban records for a number of years in various countries in Africa simultaneously, from Senegal down to Congo. The first one they put out was the Peanut Vendor, right? And they put out Arsenio Rodriguez. They put out some stuff that wasn't Cuban, but mostly Cubans, with the result that every Afro-pop singer who became an international superstar had grown up playing Cuban music in African bands. Cuban music transformed the music of the motherland in the 20th century, just as it transformed music throughout the hemisphere, and just as it's transformed music in the United States over and over. Whether it's, Louie Louie, or Smoke on the Water, or almost any tune you care to name. Rock and roll was basically cha-cha-cha plus boogie-woogie. So all of which is to say that all of these rich connections just stopped in 1961. Just stopped. And that's when Preservation Hall becomes a thing. And all this time that Pres Hall was going, there wasn't this fresh input. And, I think we have the example of Preservation Hall now as to exactly how transformative a visit to Cuba can be. Because I see a big difference in the band. Band was always great, but what do you hear? How do you hear the band different after having been to Cuba?
We definitely, even by New Orleans standards, we became more rhythmic as a band. Mm-hmm. We embraced rhythm more. We felt a certain affirmation of what we already sort of felt, and there's very few places that we can go and start playing without an explanation of who we are, what we do. I can kind of, you can do it in New Orleans, in certain neighborhoods in New Orleans. And you can do it, in certain communities in Brazil, and you can do it in Mexico. And
we know who you are in New York too.
Yeah. You go to Cuba, and immediately it's, oh, I get this. It comes. We don't even have to have a conversation about this. We all agree on sort of something, and we don't even know what that something is really. It was comforting to us because we don't look to the north for our inspiration or our family tree. We look south and further east for our family tree, for our musical family tree. So that trip to Cuba really was the beginning, because from Cuba, I don't even know how to explain going to Santiago de Cuba, but that was, explained to me, somebody said it's a country inside of a country,
Well,
and that's sort of how we feel.
I'm going to mention Haiti first.
Well, I was going to say that after that experience, everything just kept pushing us farther and farther east, and pushed us. Once we went to Santiago, we realized, oh my gosh, this is, the next step on this journey is Haiti for us. And of course that's just another step, another stop on the journey back to the source.
I want everyone to know, I brag about this all the time. I am so proud. I actually got to hang with Preservation Hall in Port-au-Prince for Fête Gede. This was just before we produced the Rumbazo. So I'm like trying to produce a Rumba festival in Cuba by phone while I'm swatting mosquitoes on the terrace of the Hotel Olafson. And I heard the combination. I think I even have a crummy video of it on my little camera. A combination second line in Rara that went on for 20 plus minutes. And I always wondered what that would sound like. And now we know. It was remarkable. And of course, Haiti is such a revelation. And God, I hope that Haiti manages to assert its sovereignty and allow and create a situation where we can once again return as respectful visitors to participate in culture and music, which everyone is only too happy to share there. Think about Santiago, Eastern Cuba. I mean, in Western Cuba, the big influence was from Africa. That's where all the African ships came, was to Western Cuba. Very few came to Eastern Cuba. Eastern Cuba, which really turned to sugar after the wars of independence. Sugar plantations were much fewer and smaller in Eastern Cuba, and the cane cutters were mostly Haitians, also Jamaicans and some others. So Haitians are the shadow of Haiti is enormous in Santiago de Cuba, and it goes back to the time of the Haitian Revolution. And it also imbues Santiago de Cuba with a revolutionary heritage, which I think should never be forgotten, that there is within Fidel's revolution was the war for independence, and within the war for independence was the Haitian Revolution. So and as we've done our post-mambo trips, we've stopped at sugar mills in the center of the island and had the cultural group of the sugar mill play for us. And in one case, a place called Primero de Enero, it was a Haitian cultural group, beautifully sewn, doing voodoo music in the center of Cuba. They said, oh, our parents came as cane cutters in the 1950s. The Haitians who wanted to remain in Cuba were given citizenship in Cuba, unlike in the Dominican Republic. And so, Sage, let's do this. I see Sage giving me the high sign. It's time to go for the tuba to tuba. Is it tuba for Cuba, right?
Cuba to Cuba. But we
Tuba
want
2 or
to
tuba
show,
4?
it's a perfect moment to show this because it's
Show this mofo.
we can see everything we've been talking about through beautiful photography and editing and filmmaking magic. So I'm going to turn over to Alyssa, who's going to show. It's only 2 to 3 minute trailer to get a
Hit
sense
it.
of everyone else gets since we're talking about. Okay, Alyssa. Oh wait, hold on. Stop. Alyssa, you gotta enable computer sharing sound in the bottom left corner when you do. Sorry, you gotta get out of screen sharing. There.
It's not a Zoom session if this doesn't happen at least once.
Okay.
You
Sorry
get out of
about
screen
that.
sharing and come back in and click on the bottom left-hand corner, enable computer sound.
Oh, that is. There we go.
New Orleans, this is the place where jazz was born. Understanding our history is understanding the elements that formed who we are. And part of that is understanding Cuba. I got my start playing jazz in New Orleans brass bands. My father played tuba.
It was his idea in 1961 to open up a club in New Orleans. He called it Preservation Hall.
Oh man, it's gonna be exciting to jam with some Cuban musicians.
I can't think of a better dignitary than Preservation Hall.
The outreach elements of this trip, where our band is interacting with Cuban musicians, is essential.
Through music, you'll be able to start a conversation.
19 hours on a bus across a mountain range.
The closer we were getting to Santiago, man, you could just feel something in the air.
You get more out of life when you believe in building bridges. This incredible musical tradition performed by these pioneers of New Orleans jazz. That's why Preservation Hall is here today.
I feel like Preservation Hall is how it's spreading the word. It's like a bridge to another world.
We came here on this musical journey and we discovered a piece of us that's been missing.
When the tuba came out, everybody lit up.
Let me say something here, because I was part of that whole trip and from the beginning. It all started in about 2013 when I brought a Cuban art musician, Hernan Lopez Nusa, to New Orleans. And he became fast friends with Ben and the Preservation Hall. And I remember in 2013, I got a text from Ben saying, I want to go to Cuba. And I wrote back to him and said, Ben, wait a little while. It can't really just happen yet. But soon thereafter, I said, come on down. And it was just incredible. Everybody was so wide-eyed on both sides, both Cubans and all the musicians from Preservation Hall. It was truly a joining of cultures in that visit. And you guys made such a impact on Cuban musicians. We hear all the time about you guys and asking about you guys and when you're coming back and all of that. So I think you made a major impact on them, but just as much as they made an impact on you, Ben. I just wanted to throw that in.
It was hearing you talk about it, Adolfo, gave me chills. Thinking about the night I met Hernan at Preservation Hall, and it was his first time in New Orleans, his first time in Preservation Hall. It's not often in life you meet somebody and immediately feel a deeper connection. I know we can all of us here have had it happen in our lives, and we can say it's not often, but those are precious, precious moments when it does happen. And it was transformative. It was a transformative evening for him. You know, I didn't even realize what it must have felt like for Hernan that night until I went to Santiago and saw what, you know, looked like doorways that looked like Preservation Hall, and saw ironwork and saw, you know, masonry work that looked like you know, it had been done by the same hands. You can only, you know, in your mind think, oh my gosh, you know, well, the food tastes the same, people act the same and celebrate the same. So obviously we're the same. I mean, somehow this is all, it's not just by coincidence. There's something, there's some sort of deep familial connection here that we felt, you know, whether it is, you know, a DNA connection or through the trade that took place between the cities. But it was real, and it's something that we still talk about to this day. And, you know, knowing that it happened, that first trip we made there happened in that small window, that moment of optimism that we all were experiencing was incredible. You know, that was something that we really take a lot of honor in being a part of that window, that moment. And, you know, we know what followed. You know, we went back again after the sanctions had been put back in place, and, you know, the rope had been tightened more, and we could see the impact, you know, on, you know, people that we had interacted with just, you know, 2 years earlier. It felt like a gut punch, you know, with your eyes closed. And, you know, we know that experience will inform everything that will ever come out, that will ever, you know, happen in our future. Everything musical, you can't just erase something like that from your life. It's part of your DNA. It's in the marrow of your bones.
And what struck me was how seamless it all was. I mean, you know, when you're putting artists together and trying to get, you know, Preservation Hall to play with another artist, et cetera,
Yeah.
it's not that easy, but it was very, very seamless. People just came together without asking questions. I remember when we started working with Emma Alfonso, which
yes.
started over at Fábrica de Arte, and all of it. It's just one family, really. It's amazing to see that, and I think that trip and the rest of the work you've done in Cuba has really shown that.
And
I mean,
when you guys
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, one of the things we kept seeing ourselves in them. You know, every one of us identified with someone there in a certain way. We were like, oh, that's the drummer that plays with all of these bands, and, you know, and then does all of these things, and, you know, oh, and he's the guy that travels to the US, and there's the bass player that plays with him and him and him and him, and he plays at that club, and he plays this style on that night, but then this night he plays that style. So it was this very interesting family reunion. It was almost as if we were seeing a mirror image of ourselves in the experience, you know, and learning a lot about ourselves, you know, because there are certain traditions in jazz in New Orleans that we saw in Cuba, but then there were also certain traditions we didn't see there. You know, we didn't, you know, Ned was talking about how New Orleans is the northernmost Catholic city, and that is something that you do hear in the music here is the Christianity in the music in New Orleans. And that was something, that was one of the things that we didn't experience. I was going to ask Ned something about that, whether or not that does exist, because in Haiti we experienced that. We experienced brass band, Haitian bands playing hymns and spirituals in Haiti, but we didn't experience that in Cuba, and I didn't know if that was just
Congo.
if it was a regional thing. Okay.
Congo is the answer. Congo
Okay.
was Catholicized in 1491. Cuban Catholicism, Haitian Catholicism, New Orleans Catholicism all have a big dose of Congo.
Okay.
I really think that's the answer,
Okay.
and it's a very important one. The 1491, the Mani Congo in Mbanza Congo converted to Catholicism enthusiastically. In order, over the next 2 generations, it was consolidated. He converted his entire kingdom. The much discussed syncretism happened before the Middle Passage in the case of Congo. And so Congo Catholicism was brought everywhere Congo people were brought. I think that's a real strong link. And that is one that also connects New Orleans, Cuba, and Haiti, which is another whole story. But
yeah.
But I want to say that the impact of the experience on the band, I keep coming back to that. And I remember you saying at the time that it had made the band more rhythmic, because I didn't, really hear y'all just suddenly start to play cha-cha-chas and stuff. You stayed being you, which I thought was you, as you said, it deepened what you already had. But there was this one number on the So It Is album that I particularly admire, 100 Fires, which is in the best tradition of American jazz, a nice hybridization of the North American feel and the Cuban feel. At least that's how I hear it. I mean, how does the bass line go? We can't do this because of the latency, but
right.
Yeah, I mean, it's the habanera bass, right? It's the classic Cuban bass, but the drummer's playing. How does the rhythm flow? How does that?
Well,
it's a swing feel. Swing,
yeah, it's the New Orleans second line beat. It's the swinging eighth notes. Yeah, it's a baka baka taka 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 taka.
So you're putting the swing thing on top of the habanera bass in a very natural way, and that to me just makes the tune glorious. I mean, it's a wonderful tune. I have yet to see the video of the version you did with the Camerata Romeo, the great string orchestra, and I was sorry I had to miss the live performance when you did it, because I had to attend my NYU students. But
one of the things that we struggle with when we play with other musicians outside of New Orleans, particularly musicians in the United States, is the rhythmic language. Whether it's rock and roll musicians or classical musicians, it's the language of rhythm that is so difficult. It's not the notes, it's not the harmony that's difficult. It's the rhythm. And when we went to Cuba, even though we feel the emphasis somewhere different, it is just so refreshing to walk into a room of classically trained musicians, and they've got incredible sense of rhythm. They can all dance and they can all move, and they have their own sense of swing. It was so beautiful. Thank you, Adolfo, for that experience. It's one of my lifelong dreams and on my bucket list to go back and to perform a whole concert with a wonderful orchestra.
I've got a clip on it. I'm going to send it to Alyssa so we can put it up.
Okay.
Yeah. I've got a question for Ned. Ned, you talked about all the different points of sort of influence between Cuba and the United States, and you know, the thing it came in different waves. Like, you know, the Spanish-American War was, you know, a time when all the Americans found out there was Cuba, basically, or knew about it more than normal. Then the publishing of Manicero. Ricky Ricardo was another point when he started with A la Bluesy.
Yes, Arnaz. Ricky Ricardo was a fictional character.
Right. Yes, he was. The massive move of the diaspora, you know, to Miami and to Florida in the 60s. The Buena Vista Social Club was a point where everybody went, wow, Cuban culture is really interesting in the United States. Cachao, when Cachao came on scene with Andy Garcia, and it became a, you know, everybody was really open to Cuba during that period. Preservation Hall going to Cuba and making this movie is another point of connection. It'd be interesting to see what the next one is going to be. Ned, do you have any ideas?
The next what?
The next big point of connection between Cuba and the United States through music.
Ooh, well, you know, that depends on what happens with the current catastrophe, you know, and how it resolves. But I want to say that at least in the history that led up to this sudden freeze that we've all experienced, what was happening was that New Orleans, one of the big things that was happening was that New Orleans had become a major showplace for Cuban music in the US. And when Ben said that, you know, they didn't have to explain themselves in Cuba, they didn't have to explain themselves because people in Cuba know how important New Orleans is. Certainly if they're musicians, they may not have had the chance to hear very much of it, but Cuban musicians, you just say New Orleans and they just get this like ecstatic look on their face. And of course, Jazz Fest did a really important thing with their Cuba feature year where they brought so many Cubans together and created, I almost want to say this, it would be I won't even say it, but let's just say it was diffused. There was a lot of musical energy that got spread around during that Jazz Fest. And I know because I talked to the Cubans after they went back, you know. I remember here you had Telmari, you had Pedrito Martinez, and then just peaking this year, we had the Sema Funk explosion, right? Which was really not something we've seen. Anything like that for Sema Funk and the whole band to come and hang in New Orleans and just marinate in because Cubans haven't had access to the rhythm, to the real funk. Funk has never, Cubans have always loved funk because it's so, I mean, it's got so much Cuba in it, first of all, but they haven't really had access much to funk. And so when these guys came and started hanging with the Soul Rebels, and then this year I had the honor of helping Big Chief Monk Boudreaux connect with percussionists there to play with Sema Funk and him together. That we actually had Mardi Gras Indians representing in Havana in January. And I just can't tell you, speaking as a New Orleanian, how that made me feel. And so I hope we can pick up where we left off, Al.
Yeah, I do too. We've got
about 10 minutes left. If I can, I want to get a couple, the last bit of time for at least one or two questions. One is from Josh Silber here. It says Preservation Hall Jazz Band playing with Don Pancho Terry and his Checare was pure magic. Is there anything like the Checare in the history of New Orleans music? What is the origin of Terry's sound? May he rest in peace. And either one of you guys can answer that. And if anyone else has a question, send it in now because we're going to wrap up soon.
Well, the analogy to that kind of sound in New Orleans music is the rubboard, right? The washboard, right? Which you hear in African American music and in various places, and it's used differently, and it has a different significance. But I mean, the shekere has really strong ritual implications in Cuba. It's I mean, there are I was just today editing a Bembe in the sugar mill town of Cologne, you know, with people playing, you know, they weren't playing bata, they were playing shekeres. So this is an instrument that talks to God.
Mm.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's not exactly that instrument in New Orleans music, a gourd with beads, you know, that's used in our music. What I found interesting was, even if there wasn't an identical instrument, they were having to find ways to express and communicate very similar to way music was communicated in New Orleans. That drums had this sacred place in New Orleans, you know, has this sacred place in New Orleans music that, you know, that people had to communicate using chairs with their hands, that because drums weren't allowed in churches, people used tambourines and used their hands as instruments and used their voices in more rhythmic ways. So even though there wasn't that specific instrument, you know, I found a lot of similarities, not just in coming up with ways to communicate and make the same, have the same sort of expression without the same instrument. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question from Anna Christian. I purchased a CD when I was in Cuba in 2012 by the Five Leyendas. Are they still recording? I have no idea who they are. Anybody know them?
The who?
The Five Leyendas.
News
the
to
Five
me.
Legends.
Was this a group that you saw playing live and bought their CD from them?
I think so.
Sounds like
Anna Christian.
That's one of the great things to do actually in Cuba. When we, you know, as I say, we take people on intense musical experiences. We have 1 to 4 live music events a day. We're on the bus, we're going the whole time, and we stop long enough to eat and sleep. And when we eat, there's always live music too, because every restaurant in Cuba's got a trio or something, and they're usually pretty good, especially if you could get them not to play Chan Chan or Guantanamera, and they always had CDs for sale, and you could build up a really nice collection of great music by people nobody ever heard of that way.
Well, it's like New Orleans.
I don't know if the Five Leyendas are that or not, but I'm just guessing.
All right, well, so we're wrapping up. I think we have most of the questions answered. I just wanted to thank Ned and Ben for doing this. It's just wonderful to relive our moments in Cuba, and hopefully we'll be doing that again soon. And I want to thank all of you who have joined in to this conversation, all of you that have been listening. Thank you so much for being part of it. Please join us again on, what's the date, Alyssa? The 30th?
The
I think it's the
20th.
30th of our next conversation is with Ruth Bahar, who is an incredible scholar of Jewish culture in Cuba, in the United States. She's got a lot to say about Cuban culture as well. Thank you so much for being part of this. Have a great weekend, and we'll be talking soon.
Thank you, Al. Great talking to you, Ben. Thank you.
Jaffe.
Thank you, Project Por Amor.
All right. See you soon.
Thank you.